while allowing its use would be the basic objective of all planning, development, and administration, and the still relatively unspoiled character of the area, the definite feeling of wilderness in part, and the unusual diversity of outstanding natural features led straight to preservation as the important consideration. This was a vision reflected throughout the plan and was strong enough to convince Missourians that the Park Service understood the sensitivity of this resource and would not overdevelop these fragile rivers. In the end, most conservationists and the Missouri congressional delegation followed Len Hall's lead and placed their hopes in the traditions and international reputation of the National Park Service, thus Public Law 88-492. 4 years later, the 11-Point Scenic River was designated under the administration of the Forest Service. And in 1972, another Ozark stream was designated as the Buffalo National River in neighboring Arkansas, under administration by the National Park Service. Public Law 88-492 should have been the happy conclusion to a long and hard-fought conservation battle. The law has good language mandating, besides recreational use, the preservation of portions of the Current River and Jack's Fork River as free-flowing streams, preservation of springs and caves. Also, a Citizens Advisory Commission was established, and Leonard Hall was its chairman. As early as 1969, though, Leonard wrote that overdevelopment for human use will surely mean destruction rather than the preservation that is specified by the law. The responsibility here is not a light one. Let's review some of the underlying concepts behind the legislation as expressed in the 1960 proposal. As a general pattern, developed areas are distributed about 15 to 20 miles apart. Additional access points are scattered generally with an average spacing of 7 or 8 miles. In the more primitive sections, they would be farther apart and with less refinement. For the upper current section from Montauk to Round Spring, the preservation of outstanding scenery and a fine feeling of wilderness would be paramount here. Developments would be kept few and simple. For the Carter-Riva section from Round Spring to Van Buren, more access, but also a sizable block along the Current River has been included to allow preservation of a significant example of typical Ozark topography. Finally, the Jack's Fork section, probably the wildest and least accessible country within the proposed monument. Preservation of the fragile wilderness quality of this stream and its beautiful setting would be paramount in planning. Following designation, the Park Service went about establishing the park. They eventually acquired more than 65,000 acres of parkland, some with 25-year tenancy allowances, primarily recreational cabins, and also permanent easements on some recreational properties, totaling over 9,000 acres. Conservationists observed these developments with optimism. As the 1960s turned into the 1970s, some of us mourned the transfer of the 3 state parks to the federals, but reasoned that they would be well cared for. Those of us who floated the rivers noted at first some improvements, including less livestock in the rivers and fewer cabins on the banks, and at least some bottomland forest coming back. But as the 70s wore on, such positive developments seemed to slow down, then stop. Then new problems emerged. As this was happening, visitors were drawn by the hope of a natural, peaceful park and river experience. But it was hard not to notice that the Park Service consistently had difficulty defending its authority to control activities on the river. Even efforts to control the number of canoes that the various canoe liveries in the area put on the river were weakened with compromises and exceptions. In the last decades of the 20th century, the rivers gained a reputation as party rivers. Tales are told of drunkenness, drugs, nudity, abusive foul language, and even violence. Although these types of affronts tend to have only temporary effects on the resources themselves, they do set a low tone, which then encourages the behaviors which result in the longer-lasting damage caused by trucks, motorcycles, ATVs, and jet boats. As all these trends were becoming apparent, Len Hall became more and more disillusioned by the weakness of Park Service management. Before he passed away in 1992, he told several friends that he was not sure the agency was up to the task entrusted to it by Congress. Where are we now? On the positive side, there are no Corps of Engineers dams on the rivers. There have been some worthwhile studies conducted of the watershed's resources, particularly of the caves, springs, archaeology, and the biota, and many people have had wonderful experiences and will continue to do so. In very recent years, there has been something of a crackdown on the most outrageous forms of party river behaviors. This crackdown has been well publicized, is a good thing and needed to be done, but once accomplished, it can create a false sense of the overall well-being of the rivers. Most floaters come in the leafy season and may not even be able to see through the dense foliage, the resource damage that lies along the rivers and in the valleys. What do we find if we pull the leafy branches aside and take a closer look? Let's examine 4 general issues. Overdevelopment. Those who envision the riverways would no doubt barely recognize the level of development that has occurred since 1964. The concept for these riverways was focused on non-motorized river recreation, but something very different has in fact evolved. For one thing, park planners and administrators have seemed to concentrate disproportionate attention and resources on the hardening and expansion of the existing principal access points. For another, and this has had the most severe impact on the river-based visitor, they have installed a seemingly never-ending series of new access points, often described as minor, but each one bringing more motor vehicles down to the rivers and usually right onto the once boat-only accessible gravel bars. The typical way this seems to have happened is that the Park Service acquired a farmstead on the river. The old private driveway, instead of being retired as it is supposed to, is never properly closed. At first, only small numbers of very local residents use this private driveway, but gradually a larger circle of regional residents discover and use it. Soon problems appear in the form of ruts, gullies, trash, and human waste. By this time, the agency may have decided that the old driveway should be closed, but also by this time, a sizable local constituency has developed a conviction of the importance of this access and its so-called traditional usages. All of this, even though the driveway had in fact been open to only the landowner and never was a public access. That historical fact becomes a political irrelevancy. In the end, the Park Service decides that the only way to contain the resource damage taking place is to install garbage cans and picnic tables and maybe grade the road where it is most rutted. Guess what's next? More people discover the new access. By this time, we can expect to see pit toilets installed and maybe demands for further improvements to the access road. This basic scenario has reoccurred not once, not a dozen times, but many dozens of times. It has happened so repeatedly that the Park Service itself has had difficulty keeping track of all of these access points. The Draft General Management Plan of 1981 identified over 50 such sites, already an altogether far more dense level of development than the original vision for the riverways. By the early 1990s, the Park Service counted over 100 such sites, and the numbers were still growing. Most of these sites had been installed without the environmental and public review required by the National Environmental Policy Act. No stretch of river today remains unclogged with what can only be described as a surplus of vehicle access. This has changed the character of the park and its river experience and tended to attract visitors with little interest in the traditional river values. And each of these over 100 sites diminishes the natural wildness of the rivers. Easements. One of the tools used by the Park Service to protect the river scenery was the purchase of conservation easements. Certain development rights were acquired on private properties so that visual and physical intrusion on the rivers would be frozen at the level on the date of purchase. These rights were paid for, and the easements are now part of the titles of these properties. It can be a good way to accommodate private ownership with minimal disruption.